8. The engine plunged into the river, taking all 5 second-class carriages with it. The force of the torrent destroyed 4 of these carriages. Those inside had little chance of survival. The leading first-class carriage, Car Z, teetered on the edge of the ruined bridge for a few minutes before breaking free from the remaining 3 carriages and toppling into the river. It rolled downstream before coming to rest on a bank as the water level fell. Remarkably, 21 of the 22 passengers in this carriage survived. Evidence suggested that the locomotive driver, Charles Parker, had applied the emergency brakes some 200 meters from the bridge, an action which prevented the last 3 carriages from ending up in the river and saved many lives. Lahars on the mountain. Lahars are a recurring natural event associated with Mount Ruapi'u. In the investigation that followed the 1953 tragedy, it was discovered that a lahar had substantially weakened the rail bridge at Tangiwai in 1925. A warning from amateur geologists that the state of the crater wall was a reason for concern had largely been ignored by the authorities. In 1954, a board of inquiry assisted by James Healy, the superintending geologist at the Geological Survey, (DSA), concluded that no one was to blame for the disaster. The police found no evidence that legal blame could be attached to any party, and there were no prosecutions. The board recommended the installation of an early warning system upstream on the Wanu River. A moderate-sized lahar that flowed down the river in March 2007 caused little damage and no injuries, thanks to a sophisticated monitoring and alarm system. Responding to New Zealand's worst rail disaster, Cyril Ellis from Tai Hape had been forced to stop his car when he reached the road bridge, which was submerged. When he saw the light of the approaching locomotive, he desperately ran towards it, waving a torch in an attempt to warn the driver. Later investigations showed that the brakes had been applied, but not soon enough to save most of those in the first 5 carriages. Ellis and William Ingalls, the train's guard, climbed in to warn the passengers in Car Z and move them to the carriage behind. Almost immediately, Car Z broke free and fell into the river. When it came to rest, Ellis, Ingalls and one of the passengers, John Holman, managed to get all but one of the 22 passengers out through the broken windows and onto the side of the carriage. As the floodwaters receded, the survivors were able to form a human chain and make their way to the bank. Arthur Bell and his wife had also stopped at the flooded road bridge and seen the express crash into the river. As his wife went to raise the alarm, Arthur helped rescue survivors from another carriage that had landed on the river bank. Those who had managed to free themselves were swept further downstream before they were able to crawl ashore. People nearby had heard an inexplicable roaring noise coming from the direction of forestry plantations, and this had prompted Leo Smith, Wairu's 22-year-old police constable, to investigate. He was one of the first on the scene and directed the rescue until more senior staff arrived from Tai Hape. In 1953 there was no national rescue organization. Members of the New Zealand Forest Service, Ministry of Works, police, Navy personnel, groups of farmers and other local volunteers worked throughout the night. The Wairu military camp provided much-needed manpower as well as transport and shelter for survivors and those involved in the rescue mission. Though the river subsided markedly within 45 minutes of the accident, overnight rescue efforts were still extremely dangerous. The fast-flowing water was full of debris brought down in the lahar and wreckage from the train. Oil and silt covered passengers and rescuers alike. Daybreak revealed a scene of utter devastation. The river and the surrounding area resembled a muddy estuary at low tide. Twisted and splintered carriages lay everywhere. The rescue operation soon became a body recovery operation. In the following days, bodies stripped and mangled by the flood were recovered as far away as the river mouth, 130 kilometers downstream. In his broadcast on Christmas Day, Prime Minister Sidney Holland asked farmers and others with property on the banks of this river as far as the sea, to keep a close watch for bodies and to send reports to the nearest police station. About 60 bodies were recovered by locals from the Mangamayu section of the river. Some of the 20 bodies that were never recovered may have been washed out to sea. George Twentymon, a young constable, was in charge of the enormous volume of clerical work involved in recording bodies and property to ensure they were kept together. This experience was to be put to good use when he took command of the rescue operation during the Waihi tragedy in 1968. The Queen awarded Cyril Ellis and John Holman the George Medal for their services at Tangiwai. William Ingalls and Arthur Bell, who had together rescued 16 people, received the British Empire Medal. While many of the survivors were shocked, filthy, choked with silt and half-blind with oil, they were the lucky ones. Identifying victims is a major task following any mass tragedy. A number of circumstances made this process particularly difficult at Tangiwai. Summer heat and a lack of refrigerated facilities meant that the initial identification had to be carried out as quickly as possible, and in some cases was inaccurate. Some of those killed were recent arrivals to New Zealand who had no relatives or local medical or dental records to help identify them. Police cleaned and laid out the bodies in coffins in a makeshift mortuary set up at the army camp. Coroner's courts were hastily convened at Wairu to legally determine identity and issue death certificates. Pathologist Dr. J.O. Mercer pronounced the main causes of death to be drowning and asphyxiation by silt. After a few days, the police inspector in charge, future Commissioner Willis Brown, made the difficult decision to hold a mass identification to speed up the process. With clergy on hand to give support, he prepared the relatives for what to expect before asking them to file past the partly opened coffins. The remaining unclaimed bodies were then transferred to hospital mortuaries in Wellington and Wananui. Christmas Day services gave New Zealanders the opportunity to express their collective grief. Many messages of sympathy were received from overseas. Queen Elizabeth made her Christmas broadcast from Auckland, finishing with a message of sympathy for the people of New Zealand. There were more than 100 private funerals, and on the 31st of December Prince Philip attended the state funeral for 21 unidentified victims who were buried in an 18-meter grave at Wellington's Karuri Cemetery. In April 1954, information from overseas confirmed that several of these bodies had been misidentified. An order was obtained to exhume the graves, a task that was carried out by police recruits. The bodies of 16, including 8 whose remains were never identified, still lie at the Tangiwai National Memorial at Karuri, which was dedicated in 1957. A further death occurred when a worker was killed during the rebuilding of the Tangiwai Railway Bridge, which reopened in 1957. Almost everyone killed at Tangiwai was traveling in a second-class carriage. 148 out of 151, traditionally located at the front of the train. These were more affected by the noise, smoke, coal dust and fumes of the locomotive, something those in first class paid to avoid. In a head-on collision or derailment, second-class passengers were at greater risk of death or injury. At Tangiwai, just 28 of the more than 170 second-class passengers survived. Only one first-class passenger was lost, along with the driver and fireman. Most of the passengers in the final 3 first-class carriages, which remained on the track, initially did not even know what had happened to their train. The Tangiwai disaster was especially tragic for the Nichols family from Palmerston North and the Benton family from Marton, which each lost 5 members, and the Fitzgerald family from Lower Hutt, which lost 4. Amidst the death and carnage, though, there were some good luck stories. 17-year-old Barbara Mae and her younger brother John had first-class tickets but could only find seats in a second-class carriage. After leaving Wairu, the guard moved them to the last first-class carriage, at the rear of the train. Almost all the occupants of their original carriage were killed. Christine Cole Catley and her 3 small children were booked to travel second class that evening, but due to a change of plans traveled a day earlier. For the rest of her life she wondered about the people who considered themselves lucky to get those tickets at the last moment. The Tangiwai tragedy killed more people than the combined total of all the other rail accidents in New Zealand history. The next worst accidents, at Hyde in 1943 and on Garu in 1923, claimed 21 and 17 lives respectively. It is worth noting, too, that in 1953 road accidents in New Zealand claimed 279 lives. Christmas Eve 1953, cricketer Bob Blair, Ryan O'Kane, is in South Africa, days away from batting for New Zealand. His fiancée Nerissa Love, Madigan's Quest's Rose Msiva, is boarding an ill-fated train, which in this excerpt will plunge into the Wanu River at Tangiwai, in the country's worst rail disaster. The Dominion Post's Linda Burgess found this TV movie retelling of the tragic romance first rate, noting consistently excellent performances from O'Kane, Msiva, and Miranda Harcourt as Nerissa's wary mother. Tangiwai won 4 NZTV awards, including Best Cinematography. A dramatic story about a cricketer and his fiancée. It was an extraordinary story,